Hey everyone, welcome to another deep dive. This time we're going to be taking a look at Cambodian criminal law.
Sounds interesting.
Oh, it is. It is.
Okay.
And we're going to be focusing on the excerpts we have from their criminal code and their criminal procedure code.
Yeah.
So kind of like getting into the nitty-gritty of how their justice system works.
All right.
And we'll see. Victims actually play a bigger role than you might think.
Okay. Looking forward to that.
Yeah. So one of the things that I found really interesting is how Cambodia's legal system, very clearly defines everyone involved in a crime,
Yeah.
So it's not just about who committed the act itself,
Right.
but, who might have influenced them to do it, who assisted them, all these different the other nuances.
Yeah, and that's really fascinating how it allows for a much more comprehensive understanding, I think, of criminal responsibility.
So it's like a legal puzzle figuring out.
It is. It's like you're putting together the pieces, figuring out who played what role and how does it all fit together. The foundation for this entire system really is laid out in Article 1 of the Criminal Code. And it's quite fascinating because it's not just about punishing wrongdoers, but it clearly defines what constitutes a crime in the first place. It establishes who can be held responsible for those crimes. It outlines the potential consequences, and it even details how those laws are going to be enforced.
So it's like a blueprint for maintaining order.
Absolutely. It's like the rule book by which society tries to function and stay in balance.
Yeah.
So you can really appreciate the structure and the thought that goes into building a justice system. It's not just about reacting to crime, but having a framework in place to address it.
Yeah, I like that. Okay, so then Article 24, this is one that stuck out to me too.
Okay.
This is where it emphasizes the principle of individual criminal responsibility.
Yeah.
So basically it's saying you are only accountable for your actions, not someone else's.
Precisely. You're not responsible for someone else's choices.
Right.
Only for what you do.
Okay, that makes sense to me.
Yeah.
Okay, so then we have to talk about Articles 25, 28, and 29. And this is where it kind of breaks down the roles people can take on in a crime, right?
Exactly. So we have the perpetrator, the instigator, and the accomplice.
Okay.
Right. And the perpetrator is the one who carries out the crime. The instigator, you can kind of think of them as the mastermind.
Okay.
The one who convinces or pressures somebody else into committing the crime. And the accomplice is the helper, the one who provides support or resources to the perpetrator.
So it's like we're assigning roles in a play.
But with much higher stakes.
Yeah.
Now, here's where it gets really interesting. Article 28 states that instigators are punished the same as the person who actually committed the crime. So let's just say, hypothetically, I convinced you to steal something. Under Cambodian law, we would face the same consequences, even though I didn't physically take anything. So what do you think about that?
I mean, that's a tough one.
It is a tough one.
Seems a little harsh.
Yeah.
But I guess I see the logic because the instigator is the one who kind of puts the wheels in motion, right? So maybe their influence is just as powerful as the physical act itself.
Yeah, that's a great point. So it seems like Cambodian law is sending a message about the weight of influence and persuasion, especially in criminal activity. It really is food for thought.
Yeah.
Does simply planting the idea, does that make someone equally responsible?
That's deep. Okay, so we're moving on now to Article 30.
All right.
This one defines public officials and elected officials.
Okay.
And this is kind of a broad category. So it's anyone from senators all the way down to local commune councilors.
A wide range of individuals.
Yeah.
Why do you think they have a separate definition in the criminal code?
Well, because they're held to a higher standard.
Right.
They're in positions of power. So their actions have a greater impact.
Exactly. It acknowledges that public officials and elected officials, they hold positions of authority, and their actions can have a much wider ripple effect on society, right? And their crimes, they often involve a breach of public trust.
Yeah.
So this distinction in the criminal code really emphasizes that their status is a factor in how their offenses are viewed and handled.
So it's not just about their individual actions.
Right.
But also the potential damage to public trust and the institution they represent.
You got it.
Okay, yeah.
Now let's shift gears a little bit and focus on the role of the victim.
Okay. Because this is where it gets really interesting, I think.
It does, especially in Cambodia's criminal justice system.
Lay it on me. I'm ready to hear about victims' rights in Cambodia.
Article 25. This is the pivotal one.
Okay.
It recognizes the victim as a distinct entity in the criminal process.
Okay.
They are not just some faceless bystander. They have specific rights and the power to actively participate in the proceedings.
Oh, wow.
Article 26, for instance, outlines the victim's ability to choose.
Okay.
To drop their claim for compensation, money they might be awarded for their losses, or even to withdraw the entire complaint altogether.
Wow. So they really do have a say in whether the case moves forward.
Yes, but here's a fascinating twist. Even if the victim chooses to withdraw,
Okay.
the criminal case itself might still continue. There are only a few specific exceptions to this, and those are outlined in Article 8, which we'll unpack a little later. But for now, just keep in mind that...
So the state can continue to pursue justice even if the victim doesn't want to.
Yes.
Why is that?
Well, it highlights a very important principle. The state has an interest in upholding the law and safeguarding social order,
Okay.
right? So it's recognizing that a crime isn't just a personal offense against one individual,
Okay.
but it's a disruption to the fabric of society as a whole.
Wow. Yeah.
So sometimes the state might deem a crime so serious that it needs to be prosecuted regardless of the victim's personal wishes.
I mean, that's a big responsibility for the state to carry, but I understand the principle.
Absolutely. Imagine being the victim.
I mean, wow.
You would have that power to decide whether or not to press charges.
That's a lot to carry.
It is a lot to carry. It's a very complex situation. So Cambodian law is trying to strike this delicate balance between the victim's personal choice and that broader societal interest
Yeah.
in justice.
Yeah. No, that's good. That's good.
Now that brings us to the question of how and when a criminal action comes to an end. And Article 8 of the Criminal Procedure Code is where they list out the various scenarios in which a criminal action can be extinguished.
Okay.
Right. So, for example, if the accused person dies, obviously the case cannot proceed. But there's one very interesting point in Article 8
Okay.
that deals with amnesty or pardon by the king.
Wow. Okay.
That's right. And Article 148 of the Criminal Code comes into play here. And it states that even if the king grants a pardon, the victim's right to seek reparations for the harm they suffered, that is not automatically erased.
So even with a royal pardon, the victim can still pursue their own separate claim for damages.
That is exactly right.
Wow. It shows a deliberate effort to protect the victim's interests, even when a higher authority like the king has intervened.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. It's recognizing that a pardon doesn't just magically erase the harm that's been done to the victim.
Okay. Yeah. That makes sense.
So it's a really interesting balance of power there.
Yeah, it really is. It seems like the Cambodian legal system is designed to acknowledge the human impact of a crime, not just the, legal ramifications.
Yes, that's a great observation.
Okay.
All right, so now let's dive into some specific crimes and explore how these victim protections actually play out in real-life scenarios.
All right, I'm ready.
Let's start with a particularly sensitive topic.
Okay.
Article 239, which defines the crime of rape. And this is where we see some powerful legal mechanisms aimed at protecting victims.
Okay, what kind of protections are we talking about here?
Well, the law recognizes what are called aggravating circumstances. These are factors that, if present in a crime, can actually increase the severity of the punishment. Okay, so it's like saying this crime was especially bad because of X, Y, and Z, so the punishment needs to be harsher.
Precisely.
Okay.
Articles 240 to 243 detail some of these aggravating circumstances in rape cases.
Okay.
So, for example, if the rape was particularly violent, if the victim was a minor, or if the perpetrator was in a position of authority over the victim, all of these factors would lead to a more severe sentence.
So it's not just about the act itself.
Right.
It's also about the context in which it happened and the vulnerability of the victim.
Exactly. The law is taking those power dynamics very seriously, and it really aims to protect those who are most vulnerable.
Right, yeah.
And it shows a clear intention to make the punishment fit not just the crime, but also the specific circumstances surrounding it.
That makes a lot of sense.
Now let's introduce another key player in the Cambodian criminal justice system.
Okay.
The prosecutor.
All right, what's their role in all of this?
So Article 58 of the Criminal Procedure Code is crucial here. It grants the prosecutor significant authority over investigations. They direct judicial police, the folks who are responsible for gathering evidence, conducting interviews, all of that.
Right.
And here's the kicker. The prosecutor can even revoke the investigative powers of these judicial police and agents if they deem it necessary.
Wow, so they really do have a lot of power to make sure that investigations are done properly.
They do.
It's like they're the conductor of the orchestra.
Yes, making sure everyone is in sync, everyone's playing their part correctly,
Yeah.
and they hold a great deal of responsibility in ensuring that justice is served.
This is so insightful.
It's a complex system for sure.
It is, but I'm starting to get a real grasp on, how it works, how it tries to balance the interests of the state, the rights of the accused, the needs of the victim.
And that's what we're going to continue to explore in our next segment.
I'm eager to learn more.
Mm.
Particularly interested in how the Cambodian system approaches alternative penalties, like community service and things like that. Is jail time always the only option?
It's a great question, and it's something we'll dive into right after a quick break. Stay tuned. There's a lot more to uncover.
All right, we'll be right back. Oh, so before the break, we were talking about the prosecutor's role, and I'm really curious about something. We've talked about punishment, but is prison always the outcome in Cambodian law? What about alternatives like community service?
You've hit on a really important point. Cambodia's criminal code doesn't just start at imprisonment. It provides a surprisingly diverse range of ways to address criminal behavior. For example, Article 49 talks about how sentences are determined. And it takes into account things like, how serious was the crime, the specific circumstances surrounding it.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all approach.
Not at all. There's a recognition that punishment should fit not only the crime, but also the individual involved.
Okay.
And this is where it gets even more interesting. Articles 55 to 60, they outline a whole menu of alternative penalties. We're talking about things like forfeiting certain rights, being banned from practicing a particular profession, even restrictions on driving.
Wait, hold on. So instead of jail time, you could lose your driver's license.
That's right.
That's a pretty powerful deterrent, especially in a place where driving is essential.
It is. It's a way of making the punishment directly relevant to the crime in the person's life, right?
Yeah.
So if somebody's convicted of drunk driving, suspending their license makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
It directly addresses the behavior that led to the offense. And for some people, it might be even more effective than a short jail sentence.
I can see how that would make someone think twice.
Exactly. It hits close to home. Building on that idea, Article 67 talks about prohibiting somebody from operating a business or an establishment.
Okay.
So imagine this. A business is caught engaging in illegal activities, right? Like selling counterfeit goods.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of just fining the owner, they could be prohibited from running that business anymore.
Wow.
It targets the source of the crime, helps prevent further harm.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's a way of protecting the public and discouraging, future criminal activity. Now, you mentioned community service earlier, and I'm curious about how that works in Cambodia.
It's definitely an option within their legal system. Article 73 specifically states that community service cannot be for the benefit of a specific person. Like, you can't be sentenced to, doing chores for your neighbor.
Right.
It's about giving back to the community as a whole.
Something like cleaning up a public park or volunteering at a local charity.
Exactly. And to make sure it's structured and effective, Article 74 says that community service is governed by specific regulations.
Okay.
It's not just random tasks. There are guidelines. There's oversight to ensure it actually benefits society.
So there's accountability built into the system.
Absolutely. And just like other forms of punishment, there are limits. Article 102 sets a time limit for community service, stating that it cannot be longer than 1 year.
Okay, so it wouldn't be fair for someone to be stuck doing community service indefinitely, right?
Mm-hmm.
It seems like Cambodia has really thought through these alternative sentencing options.
They've definitely put a lot of effort into creating a system that allows for flexibility and considers various approaches to, punishment and rehabilitation.
Okay, so we've talked about alternative penalties, but what about those situations where the crime is more serious? How does the Cambodian legal system factor in things like premeditation or repeat offenses when deciding on a sentence?
That's where the concept of aggravating circumstances comes back into play.
Uh-oh, right.
Remember we discussed how those circumstances can lead to a more severe punishment, like in cases of rape?
Yeah, it's like adding weight to the sentence based on the specific details of the crime.
Exactly. The Cambodian Criminal Code actually lays out some general categories of aggravating circumstances that can apply to many different offenses. So, for instance, Article 77 talks about organized criminal enterprises. And that means any group that's formed with the intention of planning or committing crimes.
Gotcha.
So think about it this way. If you commit a crime as part of a larger organized group, it's considered much more serious than acting alone.
Yeah.
It suggests a higher level of criminal intent and a greater potential for harm.
Right, like it's the difference between catching a shoplifter versus busting a whole smuggling ring.
Exactly. The organized aspect makes it a much bigger deal.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Article 78 introduces this concept of premeditation, which basically means planning a crime in advance.
Okay.
It's the difference between acting impulsively in the heat of the moment
Right.
versus, coldly calculating a crime.
Yeah, that's scary.
It is. So if you plan out a robbery weeks in advance,
Mm-hmm.
that's considered much more serious than a spur-of-the-moment decision to steal something.
Right, because premeditation shows a greater, disregard for the law.
Exactly. It implies a higher level of culpability because it suggests a deliberate choice to commit that crime, knowing the consequences.
It's chilling to think about someone plotting a crime like that.
It is. It adds a whole other layer to the crime.
Okay.
Article 79 deals with forced entry.
Okay.
Pretty self-explanatory. It's about breaking into a place illegally, using force to overcome any barriers.
Right, and that adds a whole element of fear and intimidation, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It's a violation of someone's personal space, their sense of security.
Yeah.
And Article 80 takes it even further
Okay.
by specifying that forced entry can include using things like false keys or keys that were obtained illegally.
Wow.
So it's a reminder that breaking and entering isn't always about brute force.
Right?
It can also involve deception and manipulation.
It's interesting how the law tries to cover all the angles.
It does. Now let's talk about how past actions can influence future consequences.
Okay.
Article 85 states that if somebody commits a felony, a more serious crime, after already having a final judgment for another felony, they face a harsher penalty. So in other words, repeat offenders are punished more severely.
It's like the 3 strikes you're out rule.
Exactly.
If you haven't learned your lesson the first time, the consequences become more severe.
Precisely. It's about holding people accountable for their patterns of behavior
Yeah.
and recognizing that repeat offenders pose a greater risk to society.
Okay.
Article 86 takes this a step further.
Okay.
Even if that second offense is a misdemeanor, a less serious crime,
Okay.
the maximum prison sentence can be doubled if it's committed within 5 years of a felony conviction.
Wow. Okay. So even a smaller crime can land you in bigger trouble if you have a recent felony on your record.
Exactly. It's about sending a message that continued criminal behavior,
Right.
regardless of the severity, won't be tolerated.
Yeah.
Now, to avoid any confusion, Article 91 clearly defines a final decision as one that can no longer be appealed.
Okay.
This ensures that those previous convictions are properly recognized and factored into sentencing.
So it's all about creating a system that's consistent and holds people accountable for their actions. But it's not always about harsher punishments, right? What about factors that might lessen a sentence?
That's where mitigating circumstances come in.
Okay.
Article 96 is key here. It emphasizes the importance of individualizing penalties.
Okay.
This means that the court should consider the specific circumstances of the offense, the character of the accused, their motives, even their behavior after the crime when determining a sentence.
So it's taking a holistic view of the person and their circumstances, not just focusing on the crime itself.
Exactly. It acknowledges that there's a human story behind every crime.
Yeah.
And understanding that story can be crucial to delivering a just sentence.
Right.
Now, to prevent arbitrary or biased decisions, Article 98 requires the court to give clear reasons for either granting or denying mitigating circumstances.
So there's transparency in the system.
Yes, transparency is key to maintaining public trust in the judicial process.
Okay. Yeah.
We've covered a lot of ground on how sentences are determined
Yep.
and what factors can make them more or less severe.
Right. But I'm curious about how these concepts actually play out in practice, especially when it comes to something like community service.
That's a great question, and it's one we'll delve into right after we take a short break. Stay with us as we continue our deep dive into the fascinating world of Cambodian criminal law.
All right, so before the break, we were discussing how Cambodian law weighs different factors when determining criminal sentences, and I'm particularly interested in how community service works in practice.
Yeah, it's a really interesting aspect of their system. Article 101 focuses specifically on community service as a penalty, and it mandates something pretty important. The court has to inform the accused person of their right to refuse community service.
Oh, so they can't be forced into it.
Exactly. It's presented as a genuine alternative, not a default punishment.
Okay.
And their choice, whether they accept or reject community service, it's actually recorded right there in the court's decision.
Okay, so that makes sense.
Transparency.
Yeah, transparency, and it respects the individual's agency.
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah?
Now, to make sure this community service is actually meaningful and beneficial, Article 103 lays out how it's implemented.
Okay.
The prosecutor is responsible for choosing a legal entity that will benefit from the service.
So like government agencies or nonprofit organizations?
Exactly, things like that.
Okay.
It's about making amends in a tangible way.
Now, what happens when someone's convicted of a crime but doesn't immediately serve their sentence?
That's where the concept of a suspended sentence comes, and Article 107 actually lists out the specific types of penalties that can be suspended.
Huh.
So this basically means the convicted person might be given a probationary period,
Right.
and during that time they have to meet certain conditions to avoid actually serving the full sentence.
So it's like a second chance to prove that they've learned from their mistakes.
Exactly.
Right.
It's an opportunity for rehabilitation,
Yeah.
reintegration into society,
Hmm.
but there are consequences for failing to meet those conditions.
Right.
Article 108 outlines the reasons why a suspended sentence could be revoked. So, for example, if the person commits another crime during their probation or fails to meet the requirements that are set by the court.
So it's a system of accountability, but it has these safeguards built in
Exactly.
to protect the community.
Now, Article 112 talks about cases where the accused is facing a petty offense, a less serious crime. If the person hasn't had any prior prison sentences, the sentence can be suspended altogether.
Okay, so it's like saying, this is a minor offense, you have a clean record, we're not going to impose an immediate penalty.
Exactly.
Right.
It's a more lenient approach.
Now, I'm curious about this concept of day release. What does that entail?
Oh, that's a really interesting mechanism.
Right.
Article 127 explains that day release allows convicted individuals to leave prison during the day under certain conditions,
Okay.
usually for work or educational purposes.
So it's a way of helping them, maintain some connection to the outside world,
Right.
prepare for their eventual release.
It's about easing that transition back into society.
Yeah.
And Article 129 makes it clear that the time spent on day release is actually deducted from their overall penalty.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So if someone spends, say, 8 hours a day working outside the prison, that time is subtracted from their remaining sentence.
Okay, that seems fair.
They're still serving their time, but they're also contributing to society,
Right.
gaining valuable skills.
Yeah, it's a win-win.
Now, what happens when somebody commits multiple offenses?
Ooh, yeah, that's a good question. How does the system handle that?
It can get complicated,
Yeah.
but Article 137 addresses this directly.
Okay.
It establishes what's called the principle of single prosecution for multiple offenses.
Okay.
This means that even if someone committed several crimes at different times, they'll be tried for all of those offenses at once.
Gotcha.
It streamlines the process,
Yeah.
avoids unnecessary delays, expenses.
And it prevents the victim from having to go through multiple trials.
Exactly.
So it's like a more efficient way of handling things.
It keeps the focus on addressing all of the crimes holistically.
Now, let's revisit this concept of pardons. Remember how we talked about the king's power to pardon someone?
Yes, a fascinating aspect of the Cambodian legal system.
It is. Well, Article 148 clarifies something really important about pardons. It states that even if someone receives a pardon, it doesn't automatically erase the victim's right to seek reparations for the harm they've suffered.
So even if the king forgives the crime, the victim can still pursue their own separate claim for damages.
That's right.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's acknowledging that a pardon doesn't erase the harm that was done to the individual,
Yeah.
and they still have the right to seek justice for themselves.
It's a reminder that the victim's needs should never be overlooked.
Yeah.
Even when high-level decisions like pardons are involved.
And it's not just about financial compensation, right? There are other ways to protect victims, especially when it comes to sensitive crimes.
Absolutely. For instance, Article 154 prohibits the publication of any information that could identify a victim of rape or indecent assault.
Okay.
It's about safeguarding their privacy, preventing further trauma or stigmatization.
That's incredibly important. Victims of these types of crimes deserve to be protected from, public scrutiny. It's about respecting their dignity and their right to heal.
Now let's talk about how the Cambodian system approaches young offenders.
Okay.
Article 160 outlines how courts handle sentencing for minors over the age of 14.
Okay.
So if a minor is convicted of a crime, the court has the option of imposing a reduced sentence, taking into account their age and the specific circumstances of the crime.
It's recognizing that, young people's brains are still developing.
Right.
They don't always have the same level of judgment or impulse control.
Exactly. So the focus shifts more towards rehabilitation rather than punishment.
And to make sure that rehabilitation is effective, Article 165 lays out specific obligations for minors who receive a suspended sentence with probation.
Yes.
So this might include things like attending school regularly, participating in counseling programs,
Right.
or avoiding certain activities or places.
It's about creating a supportive structure to help them make better choices.
Yeah, okay, that's good. Now, we've talked a lot about individual criminal responsibility, but what about when it's not just an individual, but like a company or organization that breaks the law?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's becoming increasingly relevant in today's world.
Yeah.
Article 167 specifically states that legal entities can be held criminally responsible for certain offenses.
Wow.
So we're talking about corporations, organizations, businesses.
So if a company engages in criminal activity, it's not just individuals within the company who face consequences.
That's right. The entire entity can be held accountable.
Okay.
And the penalties can range from fines all the way up to dissolving the entity completely.
Wow. Okay.
And then Article 171 allows for the placement of a legal entity under judicial supervision.
Okay.
So imagine this. An external monitor is appointed to oversee the company's operations and make sure they're complying with the law.
So it's not just about punishment, it's also about prevention and reform.
Exactly. It's a more proactive approach.
And to make sure the punishment fits the crime, Article 178 provides guidelines for what to do with items that are confiscated from legal entities that are found guilty of offenses.
Yeah.
So these items could be sold, destroyed, or even used to compensate the victims.
That's right.
It's like closing the loop, right?
Yeah.
Ensuring that the proceeds of criminal activity are dealt with appropriately.
It is. And that brings us to the end of our deep dive into Cambodian criminal law. We've covered a lot of ground.
We have.
From the foundational principles to the specific crimes and the various ways the system tries to balance the interests of the state, the rights of the accused, and the needs of the victim.
Yeah, it's been really fascinating to see how their legal system works.
It is a complex system, but I think we've managed to shed some light on its intricacies.
Absolutely. I feel like I have a much better understanding now of how justice is pursued in Cambodia.
And remember, this is just a glimpse into a very complex legal system.
Right, there's always more to learn.
Always more to explore.
Well, thank you so much for guiding us through this deep dive.
It's been my pleasure.
And to everyone listening, thank you for joining us.
We hope you found it as fascinating as we did.
We'll see you next time for another deep dive into a new and interesting topic.
Until then, keep exploring.